I'm currently going through the process of redesigning and rebuilding my entire agency website, and because of that, I've been spending a lot of time here inside of Figma recently. Now, one thing I'm reminded of every time I get back into using Figma a bunch is just how important it is to have a design system set up for your designs. Not only does this make it a whole lot easier to keep things consistent inside your design file, but it makes it a whole lot easier as you go to develop out the website because you have nice patterns for everything to follow. In today's video, I'm going to show you how I go about setting up a design system for buttons. I'm going to be just designing something from scratch, and we're going to be kind of making up the colors as we go, but I'm going to talk you through my thought process of how I might pick colors based off a company's branding. Now, if that sounds like something that'd be interesting for you, stick around and let's get started. Okay, so here we are inside of Figma, and I haven't got much started yet. Basically, we have this design page here where I'm working on a hero design, and I've created a second page here called assets where we're going to be actually building out our button in. Inside here, I've already dropped in just a copy of my logo where we can sample some colors as we design the colors for these buttons. But other than that, nothing else is included in this file, so we're really at the very beginning of the process. So what I'm going to do to start designing my button is work here inside the assets folder, and I'm going to grab the text tool and we'll just write the word button. Now we want to make sure as we're starting to build out this component, everything's going to kind of layer on top of itself. So we want to make sure we have the right font and size and all those kinds of things. By default, I got this exactly the way I want it. So I'm going to leave that just as it is. Now to make it look more like a button, I'm going to grab the rectangle tool and we're just going to roughly grab a shape around that text that gives us the appearance of a button. Now I'm going to go ahead and right click this and we'll send it to the back so we can see the text in front of it. I'll highlight both of these items and press Shift A, which is going to turn this into an auto layout, and that's going to give us all the controls here to set our padding sizes and all that. So the first thing we're going to be designing here is kind of our primary button, the button that's going to be used the most on our website. So let's first decide kind of the size of this button. Now here inside of Figma, we're actually going to have to work in pixels. Now when we go to actually build this out in our website, I would actually use M's for the padding. That way our button will scale based on the font size. But here inside Figma, we're limited to pixels, so we're going to stick with that. Now we're not actually going to be building this out on our website in today's video, but if that's something you're interested in, let me know down in the comments and maybe I could do a part 2 to this video where we actually go build out this design system for our buttons inside GeneratePress and GenerateBlocks. So to start out, I'm probably going to do something maybe like 32 pixels padding left and right, and maybe 12 pixels padding up and down. We can't really see this button, so let's go ahead and work on the background color first. Now we're just going to pretend we don't already have a palette for this project, and I'm going to use the logo as the base and kind of show you how I'd work through that on a basic client project that doesn't have a lot of brand guidelines. So what I'm going to do here on this frame under the fill, I'm going to click into this gray swatch, and I'm going to use the eyedropper tool so I can sample the color from the logo. Now in this logo, the primary color is this blue, and I'm going to be using more blues and whites throughout a website like this and not a ton of orange. So for my primary button, I really want this to be that primary blue color from the logo. So we'll go ahead and sample that there, and we can see we're now using that blue color. Now, of course, this leaves us with pretty poor contrast with black text. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the text and we'll change the fill from black over to white. Now our button's starting to take shape and we have some good contrast. I don't want to leave the corners of this completely squared off. So again, I'm going to go to my frame here and we'll go up to the border radius, and I might change this to something like, I don't know, maybe 4 pixels just to give it a little bit of rounded corners on it to make it a little bit more smoothed out. Now it's going to be important as we build out this design system in Figma that we be really careful about how we're naming all these frames. If we name all this properly now, it's going to make creating components out of it a whole lot easier later down the road. So for this first frame, instead of calling it frame 1, I'm going to call it primary since it's my primary button. And then I'm going to type a / and I'm going to say default. Now the default is going to be the default state. We're also going to have a hover state. So let's go ahead and build out that hover state since I have the basic outline of my primary button here. I'm just going to go ahead and drag a copy of this button and we'll change the primary default to primary hover. All right, so we need to have this button change somewhat on hover, and a pretty common thing I'll do is just change the fill color from the primary brand color to something lighter or darker. Now this color is already pretty dark, so I think we're gonna have to go with something lighter to make it pretty obvious that we're hovering over this button. So again, I'm gonna go to the fill here, and I'm gonna make sure that this is set to HSL. That way we can change the saturation and the luminance without changing the hue. This way I can kind of keep it in the same color family. So what I'm going to want to do is change this lightness from maybe 8 to, I'm going to hold shift and press up, and up to 18 makes it quite a bit brighter here. But you can see the saturation of this just feels a little bit too strong. It doesn't seem to go with this button that well, even though they are the same hue. So often when I boost up the luminance, I will actually bring down the saturation. So I'm going to hold shift again and press my down arrow, maybe 2 or 3 times, just to make this button a little more subtle. And I think these two colors together work pretty well. So basically you'll have this as your default state for your primary button. And when you hover over it, you'll have a bit of a lighter color. Now for me, this works perfectly for my primary button. And this is the button I'm going to be using probably throughout 80% of the buttons I use on the website. But we're going to need a few variations as well. So let's talk about those. The next one I'm going to make is my contrast button. So typically what I'll do for my contrast button, of course, I'm going to change this name here from primary to contrast, and we'll change this to contrast/hover. Typically what I'm going to do for this contrast is have the action color on my website. Usually the action color is another brand color, but something we use a little bit more sparingly and that has really good contrast. So if we go back to my logo, we can see we have this nice bright orange here, and I think that's going to work perfectly for my contrast button. So inside the fill, I'm going to click into the swatch again. We'll grab the eyedropper tool and we'll just sample from this orange here inside the rocket ship. Now we can see already that this button's definitely going to stand out, and we'll just use this in really limited cases when we want to have a primary call to action, like when we want somebody to call us or fill out our contact form. But we will definitely reserve this for just a few spots on the website so it doesn't get overused. Now we also need to come up with this hover variation. So I'm going to do the same thing here where we just grab this fill color, we'll sample this original orange, and then we'll work on the HSL scale to change this color. Now with our primary button, we actually went to a lighter color, but I'm afraid if we did that here on our orange, we'll bump this up to 59. You can see it's getting kind of creamsicle looking, and we're losing some contrast between the orange and the white text. So I think we actually need to go the other way on this button. Instead of doing up to 59, where we started originally at 49, I'm going to go ahead and go down on the lightness to 39. This darkens the button up a little bit, and it's still going to show us a pretty clear indicator that we're hovering over the button, but we're going to keep some nice color contrast here. So with that, we have both our primary and contrast buttons, and these will cover a big percentage of our website, but I have found that there are cases where I need a few more button types here. So what we're going to do for our next button type is make a copy of our primary button. So I'll go ahead and drag out a copy over here, and instead of primary, we're going to call this one secondary A. And the reason we're giving this an A is because I'm actually going to show you two different versions I often use for a secondary button. First, we'll build out this A version, and then I'll show you the B version. I usually don't use both on the same project, but I will use one or the other. So we'll go ahead and just show you both here, and you can choose what works best for your projects. Now for my secondary button, I usually want this to be a more subtle call to action, even more subtle than the primary one. So often what I'll do is just grab this background color here from our primary, and I'm just going to bring the opacity down to about 10%. This will give us just a very, very light shade of our primary color, and this works pretty well, especially when you're dealing with cool colors like this blue. Now, of course, our white isn't going to contrast very well, and we want to stay within the family of the brand. So I'm just going to go ahead and click the I button on my keyboard to get the eyedropper, and I'm going to sample from this primary color from our original button. So now our secondary button kind of has this faded look with the brand color text on it. Now, as far as hover goes for this version, I think the primary hover works just the same here for the secondary hover, so I'm pretty happy to leave it just like that. But let's talk about our B version of this secondary button. So I'm going to drag a copy of this A version here, and we'll just change this A from A to B. And what I'm going to do on this version is do an outline button instead of this kind of muted button. So for that, we'll just go ahead and get rid of the fill completely and add a stroke. For our stroke color, again, I'm just going to sample from this primary color. And on hover, I think this original hover we had from our primary button works just fine here too. Now, like I said, I probably wouldn't use this version of a secondary button and this version on the same site, but some sites kind of lend themselves to this outline version, while some look better with kind of this muted version. So you can see what works best for you. Like I said, I probably wouldn't use both in the same project. However, there is one other button style that I find myself needing pretty regularly, and we can make that by making a copy of our secondary A button here. So I'll go ahead and drag another copy out here, and we'll change this from secondary A. You could call this tertiary, or I'm going to call it ghost, mainly because ghost is easier to say, and I think that's kind of what it looks like. So we'll change those names over to ghost and ghost hover. And what we'll do for this is completely get rid of the background for the default version, and on hover we're actually going to make it look like this secondary button. Now if you remember, this hover version is actually using kind of an alternate color of our blue, and I actually want to shade this back down from our original primary color. So I'm just going to go ahead and go to this eyedropper here, grab our original brand color, and again shade this down to about 10% so it matches what we have here with our secondary A. Again, I'll just go ahead and grab this text and we'll sample from our primary default button, and we have the hover version of our ghost button. Now we are just kind of willy-nilly sampling different colors from our logo, and it's much better to work in a system. So we're gonna go ahead and set that up now, but I just wanted to kind of show you some of the different thought process I go through as I pick some of these different colors. This actually works pretty well when you're building buttons because you're having to do a lot of different variations, and it makes you start thinking about the different colors you're gonna need, especially if you don't already have a color palette picked out. So we'll go ahead and select all these colors. And if we go under here, under selection colors, you can see it says see all 6 colors. We can see all the colors we've used inside this file. Now, we don't want to be just using raw hex values all over our design file. We need to actually assign these to variables. So I'm going to go ahead and go through the process of setting some of these up here. What we're going to want to do is go to our first color here, which I remember is actually our primary brand color. I'm going to click on these 4 dots here, and we're going to click the plus button and make sure we're in variable to set a new variable color. So I'm just going to call this brand primary, and we'll hit create variable. Now we'll go back into our selection colors here, and you can see our brand primary now has a name. The next color on our list is white, so we'll go ahead and just add a new variable. We'll call this white and hit create variable. This next color here, and if you're unsure what any of these colors are, you can always click this little target button and it will highlight anything that's using that color. So we can see here, this was our brand primary hover color, essentially. I don't know that these are all the best names to give all this, but we'll go ahead and click into the style again, click the plus button, and we'll call this brand hover. And we'll hit create variable. Now here we have our 2 contrast colors. This first brighter one was our contrast color, and then the other one was our contrast hover. So we'll go ahead and just add these swatches as well. We'll call this contrast. We'll go to this other one and we'll add a contrast hover, create that variable. And the last thing we have is this 10% transparent version of our brand primary. So for that, we'll just call this primary brand trans 10. This way these labels are all very explicit and we'll know exactly what they're being used for. So now if we highlight all these again, you'll see here in the selection colors, instead of having a bunch of hex values, we actually have names for all these colors. And now we'll be able to go inside of our design and use these same colors over and over again. All right, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start creating our components. So because we did a good job naming all these in a very specific way, it's going to make creating a component much more simple. So what we're going to do is just highlight all of these buttons we created. And here under the components icon, I'm going to click create component set. What this will do is create this as a set of components. Now it defaulted the name to component 1. We can change that to button, and now this component's name is button. If we look here inside of our assets panel, we'll see that we have a button local component, which is great. However, before we start using this, I actually want to go through the prototyping process to map the hover states to each one of these buttons. So inside of this, I'm going to go ahead and change over to the prototype tab. We'll click on our first button here, our primary one, and we'll drag this down to the hover version. Now, instead of on click, we want this while hovering. And we can go ahead and bring this down on all of these different buttons so we can set the hover version of each one of these buttons. All right, with that prototyping done, let's go ahead and click on our button component again and go back to the design tab. Now you can see under properties, we have two different properties, and these were based off of the names we gave each one of those frames. If we click on here, we can see the different values for this property. So this was the name of our button. So we're just going to call this maybe type. So this will be our button type, is either contrast or ghost or primary. This second property we set up here was either default or hover. So we could call this property state. That way we'll know pretty easily what button we're using and what state it's in. And just like that, we have all of our components set up and ready to use inside of our design. So let's go back in here into our design page and finish designing out this hero section. What I'm envisioning here are two buttons side by side, maybe a secondary button with a contrast button next to it, since this is kind of the main hero section on a home page. So what we'll do is go into assets, and I'm going to drag in 2 copies of our button here. Now for this button on the left, I'm going to want to change this button type, which you can see here. The type is set to primary. I'm going to change this to our secondary A, which is what I think I'll use on this design. And for the second button here, I'm going to change this from primary to our contrast button. So now we can go ahead and change the text, like this might say learn more. And this button here might say get started. And then we can go ahead and line these up, probably with an auto layout and some nice gap between them, and make sure they're centered up inside of our artboard. The nice thing about using components like this is, imagine you build out an entire website with tons of pages here inside of Figma, and you come back and decide, you know what, the border radius on these buttons isn't quite right. You would of course hate to go through every instance of your button across the entire file and change the border radius one by one. The advantage of components is we can go back in here into our assets file to this original component. I could select every one of these buttons here, and we could change our border radius from 4 to 40 to make it more of a pill shape. And it will automatically update across our entire design because we're using those components. If you're used to building websites, this is very similar to how you would use classes, but this gives you a ton of control here inside Figma as well. One thing that I always end up realizing is that I need a lot more variants than I might think of initially. Here we designed a primary and contrast button, but we also needed a secondary button that might go next to some primary buttons, and we ended up developing also a ghost button, which might work in the place of something like a text link at the bottom of a card or something like that. Now, we designed all of these with a light mode in mind, but we're also going to want to know how are all these buttons going to look when we're in dark mode. So you're going to want to go through this whole process again, maybe with your dark brand primary color as the background, and see how all of these different colors are going to work on a dark background. So while we ended up with maybe 10 different variants here, you're probably going to need something more like 20 to build out an entire website. Like I said, it's always a whole lot more than you think. Now, I won't bore you with the process of building out all the dark mode colors here, but I am curious to know if you'd like me to go ahead and continue this and show you how I would set up all these different variants inside of Generate Blocks as well. If that's something you think you'd like to see, drop a comment down below this video and let me know. Now, if you learned something new in this video, I would really appreciate a thumbs up. And if you want to make sure to catch my next one, go ahead and hit subscribe, and we'll see you next week.